Hey everybody, and welcome back to my tutorial series on how to build a desktop application style object-oriented Discord bot in Python. So what did we do last time? We set up the setCharacterName function in our details class, and we created a bunch of UI elements to help set the character name for our details. So let's take a look at that. So if we run our testing command in Discord, we get a status message that outlines the status of the details data points of our profile, and we also get a button that if we click on it, we can input our character name, and it updates the status message up here. Awesome, and it even updates the button color. So that's what we did last time, but we're still missing a couple of buttons. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create those buttons and create the functions to set that data in the profile details. All right, so back over here in our code, where I want to start is the details UI module. So this is where we defined our details status view and our character name modal. And the next data point that I want to gather from our user is the URL, because that's going to be the most straightforward one. And I want to practice the logic that we've used on the modal and on the button already without introducing any new behaviors like we would for jobs or for the accent color. So let's define that. Let's define the modal in which we get the URL, and then we can define the button and add that to the status view, and then we'll create the function in our details class that allows us to get that information. Okay, but let's define the modal first. So the behavior is going to be extremely similar to our character name modal. So I'm just going to copy that. Actually, I'm not going to copy it. I'm going to type it out because I much prefer typing it out rather than copying it. But we're going to call this profile URL modal, and it's going to be a frog modal. And then in our init, again, we're going to take the current value of our URL, which is an optional string, because remember, we're passing the underlying attribute into the modal for processing. And then in the super call, I just want to say the title, and it's just going to be edit profile URL, just like that, except with correct spelling and capitalization. Okay, so just like we did up here, we're going to add an instructions field. So I'm going to say self.addItem, and it's going to be an input text. And the style is, like we have for all of our instructions fields, multi-line. Okay, even though the instructions may be short, we just want to keep it visually the same from one prompt to the next. Okay, so the label is going to be instructions. And what else can we take in? Remember, a placeholder, a value, and whether it's required or not. So what's our placeholder going to be? Well, that's simple. Enter your profile, enter your desired custom URL. Now, our user might not know what that means exactly, but the great thing is that in the value, remember, we can elaborate. We can be a little bit more verbose with our instructions because this placeholder is only our fallback in the event that the value gets deleted somehow, just in terms of our instructions. So here, I want to actually put parentheses. Because remember, if we put strings inside of parentheses in Python and don't put commas in between those sets of strings, that's going to concatenate the strings. And so in this way, we can visualize what our text is going to look like a little bit better in the code. So what's the value that I want to, what are the instructions that I want to give to the user? Well, let's just say, enter your desired custom URL again. And we're going to put a new line, and then I also want to elaborate a little further. This will be the link that your character name will redirect to if clicked. Okay, so that's the additional information that we can provide in the value parameter here to make this instructions field, well, instructions. And again, we don't want to require this. So we're just going to put that false. So we'll drop down here and we'll add our input for the actual URL itself. So we'll say self.addItem and we'll add an input text. And then the style for this is going to be a single line. So the reason we want a single line, even though a URL may be lengthy is that we don't need to see the entirety of it. We don't need to specify a multi-line input field and see all of the URL, because chances are the user's going to put in some 9 bajillion character URL that's like an Amazon link to something ridiculous, okay? And you know how those look. Those are just total garbage. The user doesn't need to see that. So even if it extends past the boundaries of the box, it's not going to matter. So we're going to make this a single line just to save space. Our label is going to be custom URL. And then what do we want to put for the placeholder? Well, like we did up here in our character name, I like to give an example, okay? So for this example, I'm going to put in my silly little Twitter account that I use for my frog, ht:// just like that. In the value, we want to pass the current value, right? Because this is going to auto-populate with whatever our current value is in the profile details. And then we don't want to require this, because as opposed to the character name up here, which we always want to have, no matter what, we want to have a character name in our details, we want to allow the user to null out their URL if they want to. So if they have a breaking up with their froggy companion or something, and they delete their Twitter out of rage, we don't want to force them to have some sort of link on their profile. So they can null this out and it'll delete it within the profile details. So we want to not require this. Okay, and we're also not, as opposed to up here where we set a max length, the URL, the underlying URL to the title of the embed does not contribute to the length requirement. So remember, 6,000 characters is our limit for an embedded message, but the links in the embed do not contribute to that, so we don't need to worry about that here. So let's define our callback. What's the behavior we want in the callback? Well, up here in our character name modal, the behavior is going to be more or less the same, right? We're going to assign the value, and then we're going to say the modal is complete. So we've done all the processing that we need to do on the data, so then we're going to return a dummy message, and we'll close the modal itself, right? So I could even just copy this right here, okay? And that's going to be the exact same logic that we want to use when processing our custom URL, except because this is not required, we may potentially get an empty string out of this input text, right? Because if the person wants to nullify their URL, they can submit a blank input text, and that's going to give us an empty string back. But we don't really want to store an empty string. We either want to have a URL or we want to have a none value in our profile details. So I'm going to say self.children sub1.value if self.children sub1. So if there's a value, because this is going to implicitly call the Boolean function on this attribute. So if self.children sub1 has a value, otherwise, we're just going to set the value equal to none. And then we can and then once we pull the value back out of this modal in our profile details class, the value is either going to be that link or none. It's not going to be an empty string, so we don't need to worry about handling that elsewhere in our code. Okay, so let's go up here and make sure that we export profile URL modal in Dunder all. Okay, I've already done it here because I was testing something earlier and forgot to delete it. But make sure you add that to yours. Okay, and let's go over here into our profile details class. And what I'm going to do is we're going to make an async function, and we're going to call it set URL. Okay, it's going to take a self and the interaction that we generate when pressing the button, and it's not going to return anything to us. Awesome. So the behavior in the set URL function is going to be more or less the exact same behavior as our set character name function, okay? These set functions are going to have a lot of similar behavior, but just because we need to pass in different attributes and call different modals, we're going to have different functions for each one. So for this one, I want to set the modal equal to a profile URL modal and make sure we pass in self._URL. Not the post URL and not the property URL, because we don't want that NS Sentinel value here. We want either a string or none. And then our logic for sending the modal to the user is going to be the same. Await interaction.response.send modal. And then we're going to pass in the modal. And then we want to wait for the modal. Modal.wait. Alrighty, so if the modal is not completed, if not modal complete, then we're just going to return. Okay, so if the modal was canceled or if the modal timed out, we don't want to set any values in our function, we just want to leave. Otherwise, self.url, make sure we use the property for this one, equals modal.value. Okay, just like that. Okay, so let's make a button that we can click to invoke this function. So let's head back over into our details UI script. And just up here at the top under Dunder All, since I want to make sure I define all of our buttons before the view in which we instantiate the buttons, we'll be adding the buttons to the top and we'll be adding the modals, to the bottom of the module, just to keep everything organized. So let's make a profile URL button. Okay, and this is going to be a profile section button. And I'll just name it URL button to keep the naming consistent. And then here in the init method, we're going to take in the current value of the URL, which is an optional string, because remember we're passing the underlying data point. And then let's define the behavior we want from the superclass, right? So this is going to let us put in our label, whether we have it disabled, and if what we want the row to be. I'm just going to copy in these three values from the character name button, but I'm going to rename this custom URL. Okay, we don't want it to be disabled. We want the user to be able to input that, and we'll just keep the row at 0 for now. So no overriding that behavior. And let's not forget to call self.setStyle on the URL. So let's define the callback, def callback, and the callback behavior is going to be basically the same. Let's make a reference to our details so we don't have to say self.view.details every single time. And then the first thing I want to do is say details, await details.set URL, and we're going to pass in the interaction that we got from clicking the button. Okay, once this is done, so in this function, remember we're waiting for the modal pop-up to finish. Once that's done, it'll continue in our code. So we want to self.setStyle again, details.url underscore URL, and then we're going to call the await message helper again, await edit message helper. We're going to pass in the interaction. We're going to pass in the status, which is details.status. And we're going to pass in the view, which is self.view, because that button may have been updated as well. Okay, so we just need to instantiate a URL button down here. So let's add that, and we'll say self.details._URL. Okay, so now we should have 2 buttons when we start up our bot, right? Right, awesome. Okay, let's start the bot. Great, and we have no errors. And so let's grab Discord and we'll run our testing command. Okay, very good. We've got 2 buttons. Let's make sure that the first button still functions as we expect it to. Okay, good. So we got the first button still working. Second button, the modal pop-up is working. Okay, so it looks like we're not getting an update here in our message. So the custom URL didn't populate and our button didn't change. Curious. Alrighty, so let's go back over into our code and see what we can find. It looks like we didn't have any exceptions. So let's stop our bot and let's take a look around and see what we can find. So I think the issue is going to be here in our message helper. Okay, so in the edit message helper, we're passing keyword arguments to the edit function of the interaction, right? So down here in the character name, we're passing the embed keyword and the view keyword. But what I've done here is I've mistakenly said status equals. So if we try to pass a weird keyword argument to the interaction edit function, it's going to cause this to accept. And in the event that we have an exception here, we're going to pass. So this is the behavior that we defined. So this is actually working very nicely user end because the user didn't get any errors. However, that leaves us confused. So we didn't know what happened because we made this pass here. So I'm just going to put in a simple print statement. And I'm just going to say edit message helper failed. Okay, and now at least if we accept in the future, we'll know where that happened so we can pinpoint it a little more easily. Okay, so let me go back over here and make sure that we change this keyword to embed. Okay, in the edit message helper function of the URL button that we created, change the keyword argument. And let's go ahead and rerun our bot. And we'll give this one more try here. Okay, so we'll do testing. Check the character name and make sure it's still functioning properly after we made changes. Okay, we're good there. And let's do our custom URL. Hey, there we go. Okay, so the custom URL populated in the status message and our button changed. Let's also test the behavior of deleting this and nullifying the value. And as you can see, the values went back to the system not set and the button being grayed out. Okay, sweet. We're making progress. Let's move on to the color, okay? So how are we going to set the value of this field and the accent color, and how are we going to get that information from the user in a meaningful and easy to understand way? So let's jump back over here into the code. And down here at the bottom of our details UI, let's define our color modal. So we'll say class color modal, and it's going to be a frog modal. And within the init, we're going to take the current value, right? Like we do in all of our modals. And the value for the color is an optional color, which we need to go back up and import really fast. So from Discord, let's import color. And down here, let's spell it properly. There we go. So it's an optional color that we might be getting in. So up here in our URL and character name modals, we were taking in a string, so we could just directly pass that to the input text to be handled, right? But don't worry, we'll be dealing with that in a second. It's not super hard, but let's define our instructions first. So let's add an input text here. And as usual, we're going to make the style input text style dot multiline, and our label will be instructions. And for the placeholder, I want to say enter your desired accent color. Okay, short and sweet. That's the brief version. Okay, and for the more verbose version of our instructions, enter the 6-character hex code for your desired profile accent color. Okay, much more descriptive. That's exactly what we want. And of course, finally, we want to make this not required, like we do all of our instructions fields. Okay, and we'll define another self.add item with an input text. And this style is going to be a single line. Equals input text style dot single line. Our label is going to be accent color hex. And let's make our placeholder my favorite color, hash 4abc23. Okay, a lovely shade of green. And let's deal with this. Let's deal with our current value. Okay, so we have a color, and how do we get the hexadecimal version of the color class? Well, back here in our profile details, if you remember, we've done this. We've actually done this. We've literally said here in our status message, if our self.color is none, so if we have a color class in this value, we've called string of self.color.upper. right? And that should construct the hexadecimal value of that color for us. So we can do this same logic right down here. We can say the value equals the string value of current value dot upper, because remember we want to, just for stylistic reasons, we want those uppercase letters in there. And if current value is not none, because remember it could be optional. So we don't want to try and call the string converter of none, because that's just going to put the word none, and that's not going to work. Otherwise none. So if we have a none value for the color, we're going to substitute in none for this value so that nothing is in this box and that we display our placeholder. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So let's also set the minimum length and the maximum length. Now, the reason I want to do this is honestly because we can clamp the user to a minimum length of 6 characters. So a hex code is 6 alphanumeric characters, or potentially 7 if they include an octothorpe at the beginning. Right? So their hex code needs to be a minimum of 6 characters, which would be the code without the octothorpe, or putting the hash sign at the beginning would make it 7 characters. So those are the only 2 values that we want to allow in this box, because that's going to make our processing easier. Okay? And remember, we want to require the accent color in our profile, right? We always want to make sure that our profile has that highlighted color. Anyway, that's the way we're going to do it. Let's define our callback. And in this callback, we need to handle some situations. So before we do anything, I want to assign a local variable for the value of our second text input here, because I don't want to have, because we're going to be checking this value multiple times before finally assigning it to the value attribute of the modal. We want to do some processing first. So I'm going to make this local variable value equal to self.children sub1.value, and then we're just going to say .upper, because remember, stylistically, we want the uppercase letters in this, and this input text is going to be returning to us a string value of 6 to 7 characters, right? So we can reliably call upper here and not worry about causing errors. Okay, so in the event that the user has put an octothorpe before the hexadecimal value, so if value dot starts with a £, we're just going to set value equal to value 1 to the end. So we're going to lop that off at the beginning, because ultimately we don't really need that. We're just giving them the option to put that in as a stylistic thing in case they copied it from a color converter on the internet, for instance, and sometimes those will copy in the £sign with it. Okay, so this actually brings me to something that I intended to go over earlier and neglected to do so. So when we say 6-character hex code, what happens if what happens if we have a user that doesn't understand this? So we want to make our bot as accessible to everyone as possible, and sometimes people won't understand our terminology. So that's not good, especially in the situation where we have required data, okay? So I want to put parentheses here, and I want to drop this down. Because what we're going to do is we're going to put a new line at the end of our instructions, and I'm going to put another line of text called Google Color Picker with a colon and another new line. And if we open up Google here, I've typed in our color picker, and you can see that the first thing that Google presents us with is literally a color picker interface. And you can type in a hex value, and in addition, you can copy that hex value. So if you click the share button here and click on the link, we can copy that into our text and deposit that here within the instructions to give the user a link externally in case they don't have a favorite hex color. An unthinkable thing in this day and age, I understand, but in case they need to go to Google and take a look at this, we want to give them that link. Okay, so you'll see this later when we test it. But, oh, and I see here that we've forgotten the super call. So we need to, in our color modal, we need to call the init function and give it the modal's title. Just like that. Okay, otherwise we're going to be getting an error when we try to call up this modal. So we've added the color picker link here into the instructions, so hopefully that's going to make it a little easier for the user. And now we can continue with the callback. Okay, so let's drop down and let's process what the user has put in here. Okay, so all we know right now is this is a string that definitely doesn't have a hashtag at the beginning, but that's about all we know. So let's just flat out try making the value of the modal, our self.value attribute of the frog modal, the integer value of this value that we've set here, and make sure that we encode it with 16 bits. If self.children sub1.value else none. Okay, so as long as there's a value in this box, which there should be because it's required, but we're just doing a double check here. Otherwise, we're just going to set the value of the modal to none. Okay. But let's say that this integer converter encounters an error. Okay, so let's say except. What are we going to do? Well, I want to pass for now, and I want to say above the pass, I want to say write error logic, because we're going to come right back here, and we're going to write some very nice error messages that are going to give our user a lot of information, but I don't want to deviate too much from this until we've got this working at a base level. Okay, so if we encounter an exception, we're going to pass for now. Otherwise, so let's say that this succeeded. So else, if we don't accept, we're going to set the complete value for the frog modal to true. So we successfully completed the modal, and we're also going to send back a dummy interaction. Edit message, just like that. Okay, because we don't need to respond to this any further, but we still have to send back that dummy interaction response just to make Discord happy. Okay, and then down here, regardless of what happens, we want to close the modal. Right? So even if we encounter an error, we don't want the modal to stay up after the button is pressed. We want it to close regardless. So that's why self.stop is here outside of the try except block. Okay, so we're going to come back and we're going to write this error logic in a few minutes, but I want to finish out the logic having to do with obtaining the color first. Okay, and we're just going to be very careful not to pass in an improper value for the time being. Okay, great. So let's jump back over into our profile details class, and we will make an async function and call it set color. Okay, color, no U. And we're going to take in an interaction. And this is also not going to return us anything. Okay, so we did forget over here in our details UI to export this modal in our Dunder all. So let's do that. Let's say color modal right here. So now we have access to that in profile details. So let's create a variable called modal equal to color modal, and we'll pass in the underlying color value of the profile details class. Following so far? Okay, awesome, awesome. Let's await interaction.response.send modal. So we are going to send that modal back to the user, and then we're going to wait for it. So await modal.wait right here. And then the same logic that we've done in the last two functions is going to apply here, all right? Because we've done the processing within the modal. Remember? So down here in the color modal, we've already taken care of the processing. So this value is either going to be the integer value of this color, or we're going to accept. And in which case, we're going to have an error message that's going to tell the user what happened. But for now, it's important to know that this value of the modal is either an integer or none. So we have put a value in here that can be given back to the color converter. The color property, right? Because here in our color property, we could accept a color class, or we can accept that integer value. And that's why we made a union here, so that we can convert to an integer here in our modal itself. And then within the property, we will convert it to the color as needed, which is why we can pass an integer here. So I can just say, well, first I need to say if not modal.complete, right? Because if we timed out, we don't want to do this. We're going to say self.color equals modal.value. Just like that, just like we've done in all the other functions. And this is going to set the color of our embed. Because remember, in the status embed, we get the color attribute here and here. So this is already good. As long as we set it into the class, it's going to update properly in the status embed. Okay, so let's make a button that calls our setColor function over here in the details UI. So up here at the top, above the URL button, let's make another button, and we'll call it a color button. Profile section button is the superclass, and we'll define our init right here. And of course, into the init, we're going to take the color value, which is an optional color. Okay, so the important thing to know is not in this particular situation, it's not important what class it is that we have here. It's important whether this class is here at all. So what's important is that it's a class or none, because that's ultimately what we're checking in the setStyle function, is just simply whether data is here or not. So we don't actually have to process the color at all. So let's call the superclass, and let's say the label is accent color. Accent color. We will set disabled to false, and we'll set our row to 0 for now. Okay, because we want 3 buttons in each row, so the URL and the character name button will make 3 buttons for now. So we'll set these to row 0, and then I want to say, as we've done with our other profile section buttons, self.setStyle, and then pass in the parameter that we received here during instantiation. Okay, let's define our callback now. And again, this is going to mimic the behavior that we've seen in these other callback functions. So I'm going to type it out, but you feel free to copy everything from the URL button callback, for instance, because that's exactly what we're going to be doing here. Equals. And we want to await details.setColor this time. Remember, so if you copy this over from one of the other functions, make sure we pass in the proper function for the details class. And we're going to pass in the interaction. Self.setStyle again. And make sure we pass in the underlying attribute, not the property. And then let's do our edit message helper one more time. So the interaction is going to equal interaction. We're going to pass in the embed equals details.status. And the view is going to be self.view. Okay, so this is the same thing we've done in the other buttons, which is why I went a little more quickly. Let's go down here to our details status view and make sure we add the color button as a button that we want included in this container. And we'll say self.details.color with the underscore, just like that. Okay, so now, in theory, we have a modal and a button that will handle a color input. Keep in mind, in our modal, we don't have error handling logic yet, so we need to be sure that we input a value that can be parsed by this integer converter. Okay, that's really important. We will definitely come back to this. I'm even going to put to-do here, so it comes up as a to-do in our list, right there. But we want to pass for now. Okay, so now that we've included that button in our detail status view, we should be able to start our bot and test it out. Okay, so we can go ahead and start our bot. And as always, happy to see no errors here. And let's jump over into Discord and run our command. Okay, so far so good. We have the additional button. Let's click on it. All right, we've got the behavior that we want. So I'm not super thrilled with how the instructions box looks. We'll come back to that in a second. But the fact that the color picker URL is down here kind of underneath the initial line of the box, that doesn't really sit right with me. So we may redesign how this looks in a minute. But for now, if I type something into this box, it's going to tell us you have to have at least 6 and no more than 7 characters. So I'm going to type in my favorite hex, of course, and the warning goes away, and let's submit it. Okay, so we're in business. So we have a color here on the left, and our color field has been updated. Now there's a little bit of weird behavior with the emoji, and we're going to address that in a second, but our button has also been updated. And if we go in here and try to delete the color, we can't do that. So the user is now forced to have a color here, and that's going to increase the user experience. So that's okay. So let's go back into our code and figure out what's going on with this emoji and why it's not showing properly. So we can close our bot for now, and let's open up the bot emojis. No, excuse me, not the bot emojis. Let's go into the profile details, because the issue here is that we have called the string function on this by including it in f-string, right? And the string function for an enum, which is what we defined here, because bot emojis is an enum of partial emoji values. It's simply calling this literal bot emojis.arrow left is the literal string value of an enum. So we actually need to put dot value here to access that partial emoji that we assigned to the arrow left attribute of the bot emojis enum. So make sure we put in dot value here. And let's restart our bot and try this one more time. Okay, so we'll go testing. And we'll put in our accent color. And now we should have an emoji instead of the words. Awesome. So this is the behavior that we wanted. Good. So we've got 3 of our 6 buttons set up. Let's keep going. Okay, so what's the next aspect that we want to code in? Well, I'd like to go ahead and do our jobs next. I think the jobs is going to be the next thing we want to do. So let's go to our UI details file. And down here, let's define our modal for the jobs. And I haven't forgotten that we need to write our error logic here, but I want to finish out all of these modals and functions for the individual data points, because writing our errors is actually going to be its own, honestly, it'll probably end up being its own video, just because there's some specific behavior that we want out of our error messages. So we're going to come back to this. But for now, let's define our jobs modal. Okay, and this is going to be a frog modal. And then here in the init, the underlying data point for the jobs, right, which is an optional list of strings. Again, the data type is not so important here so much as the fact that there is a data point. And of course, we'll call that jobs. We need to import our list up here at the top from typing, so let's do that. Okay. And then let's go ahead and call the superclass and pass in the title that we want for our modal. And we're just going to say edit character jobs for now. And then let's talk about how we're going to get this information. So if I pull up Discord and we type in the details command to, if we preview our profile, let's do that. Let's see where the jobs fit in on our final profile. So up here at the top under the position, which again is not going to apply to us in this tutorial, we have the jobs here, and it's a string separated by backslashes, and then on either side is an emoji. Okay, so that should be pretty easy. But the thing we need to watch out for, and this isn't something that you would necessarily know, this is something that I'm letting you know based on my experience, is this line right here could potentially get long, okay? And we don't want we don't want this line to extend out of the bounds of the line of a single line, because otherwise it'll drop down and then we'll get additional jobs right here and it's going to make the formatting look really janky. Okay, so we want to make sure that we keep our jobs on this single line. So we're going to need to restrict how many characters our user can put in total. Okay, so let's go back over here and we'll start with our instructions field though. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So let's say self.add item, and it's going to be an input text. And our style, just like with all the instructions, is input text style.multiline, right? And our label is instructions. Okay, so what's the placeholder we want to put here? What's the brief version of the instructions? Well, I like to let my user enter up to 3 jobs. I think that space-wise, you can put 3 jobs here, and they can be like 15 to 20 characters, and that won't take up this entire line. So that's what I want to do here. I want to say enter up to 3 RP professions for your character. Professions. There we go. So again, placeholder is just the basic stuff. Let's elaborate in the value. I'm going to drop this down into parentheses so it concatenates these strings automatically for me. And we're going to say enter the RP professions to display on your profile. Let's go back and spell correctly. Thanks for bearing with me, folks. Profile, period. And then I want to put a space and I want to enter down. Now I'm not going to put a new line here because remember, as long as we don't have commas inside of these parentheses, this is going to concatenate the strings. So by just dropping down to another line, I'm saying that this is one long string. I just don't want to make it long and go out here. I prefer to work vertically. So that's why we haven't included a new line after the statement about displaying RP professions. So in here, let's say we're going to limit 3 for formatting reasons, because we want to tell our user why we've only restricted them to 3. And now let's put a new line. And a little bit of additional information. If you want to delete a job, just empty the corresponding box and submit the dialog. Okay, so our boxes are each going to be able to handle the behavior that if it's empty, it's going to delete that value out of the jobs list in our profile details class. Okay, and with all of our instructions, we want to make sure that it's not required. And let's define a separate input for each job. So the person can put in 3 jobs, and then with each input, we can restrict how many characters they put in on each line. So ultimately, that's going to allow us to restrict the number of characters that they put in overall. So let's go ahead and add an input text here. And the style is going to be input text style.singleline. Since these are each going to be a single item in the list, we don't need a multi-line input here. The label will be job number 1. And for a placeholder, let's put an example, like I always do, right? So we're going to say example professional frog. Okay? And then for the value, now how do we display the value from our jobs list in here? Well, again, luckily, since we have the underlying data point, which is just a list of strings, we can access that list by saying, this should be current value, excuse me. And then we want to access index 0 of the current value, because that is the first job. But what if we have none? So let's just say if current value is not none. Otherwise, we just want to pass none for the value of the input, which again is going to make it blank and display our placeholder text instead. Okay, so let's also make sure that this is not required. If the user wants, they don't have to put in jobs. I mean, that's always the preference, but they don't have to. And let's also set the max number of characters that the user can provide to us in this field. Because remember, we don't want to go past the bounds of this single line here. Otherwise, it'll drop down, and it's not going to look good. So let's say 20 characters is our max length. That'll give 60 characters if the user fills out all 3 of the jobs with their maximum amount of characters. That's typically not going to happen, but that should still, even if they decide to max out the amount of characters allowed, they should still stay on one line. Okay, so this behavior in this input is going to be the same for the other 2, so I'm going to paste it twice, and then I'm just going to go back through and I'm going to make a couple of tweaks to each one in order to change the data that we're looking at. So for the second one, we need to change it to job number 2 for the label. We need to change the value to current value sub 1. And then for the placeholder, instead of professional frog, I'm going to put taco wrangler. Okay, and now the other thing that I want to do is we can't necessarily check to see if the current value is not none here, right? And I made a mistake up here as well, because even though we're checking to see if it's not none, remember this underlying data point may potentially only be an empty list, right? Because when we pop our keyword arguments here, when we look for that jobs argument in the keyword arguments, we're saying if we don't find it to give us ourselves an empty list. So we need to plan for the fact that this may be here, but it may be empty. So I want to say if current value is not none and lang current value is, in this case, greater than 0. Okay, so we're checking to make sure that there is something in the current value parameter that we've passed. And similarly, if we pass it down here, change this to 1 and change this to 1, that means that there is going to be more than one element in the current value list, which means that we can now access the second element, which is element sub 1. Okay, and we're going to use the same formula down here on the third line. So current value sub 2, and then make sure that the length of current value is greater than 2, because that will mean that there's 3 elements in the list and we can access the third one that way. Okay, and for job number 3, make sure we change our label to job 3. And for the placeholder, what do we want to put? Let's put stunt camel. That's a good job. Okay, so these are the 3 inputs that we're going to get information about our jobs back from. Right, so let's actually do that. Let's define the callback that happens when we press the button. Okay, so what are we going to do now that we have 3 text inputs that we want to pull information from? Because our frog modal only has a single value attribute, right, that we're setting and that we're looking for in the code. Well, that value could be anything, including a list. So I'm going to say self.value attribute of the frog modal equals a list. Okay, and then what I want to do is we're going to make a list of the string values that were placed into these input texts. So I'm going to say self.children sub 1, because remember the first one is the instructions, dot value if self.children sub 1 dot value, else none. Okay? So we're making a list and we're saying we want the value of this first text input if they entered a text in that text input. Otherwise, we're not gonna assign it a value. Okay? And I want to put a comma here and I want to duplicate this twice, because the logic for gathering the data from each of these inputs is going to be the same on each line. It's just different information, okay? So at the end of this, our value of the modal is going to be a set of 3 values. Regardless, there's going to be 3 values, but they're either going to be a string that denotes the user's job or a none value saying that the user deleted or didn't enter something in that box. And we can ignore the none values later. So now that our modal's complete, let's make sure that we mark it as such. And we'll do our dummy interaction. Interaction.response.edit message. And we will close the modal, just like that. So while we're here in the UI file for details, let's go ahead and make a button that it's going to expose this, expose the function that opens the modal. So we're going to say jobs button. That's a profile section button. And here in our init, let's take the jobs list, which remember is an optional list of strings. Optional list string, and make sure we put a colon here. Okay, and I want to call the superclass as usual. Gonna call the label, let's call it other jobs, or let's call it RP jobs. And it's not going to be disabled. And then we're going to put this on row 2. Row 1. This is going to be the second row, but it's index 1. Okay, let's self.setStyle on our jobs list. And then let's define the callback. So this callback should be pretty straightforward, since we've used the formula for this callback more or less the same in all of our buttons so far. So let's just copy this. Let's just paste it right in here. And we'll edit the function that we're calling. So this is going to be setJobs. And then we also need to pass in _jobs to the setStyle function as the parameter that it's checking for the style of the button color. Okay, so those are the only two things that we need to change in our callback between the different buttons. So let's go back over here into our profile details class, and let's add a new function down here called setJobs that we just decided to call from that button. We're going to take in an interaction as we do, and there's not going to be a return. And almost forgot, let's go back over here into our details UI, and we need to export that jobs modal, or we won't have access to it in our other scripts. So jobs modal int under all. Now we can instantiate that here and pass in self._jobs, the underlying attribute, and we'll do the same await interaction.response.send modal and await modal.wait that we did last time. And then the same logic applies. So if not modal.complete, we're going to return. Otherwise, we're going to say self.jobs equals modal.value. Okay. But that might cause some issues because our modal value is a list of strings or none. But in the event that it's none, we don't want to store that value. We want to delete that value. So what I want to do is I want to make a list out of the items within modal.value. And I want to use list comprehension to do that. So I'm going to say j for j in modal.value. So we're going through each of the items in the value, and we're assigning, in turn, we're assigning that to j. Okay, so j for jobs. And then I want to say if j is not none, just like that. So this is instead of making something a bit more verbose and saying like for j in modal.value, and then we're going to instantiate a new list, and then we're going to say if j is not none, then we're going to say new list.append j. Okay, so what we've done here, we're doing in one line right here. So hopefully the way that this is simplified here in list comprehension makes a little bit of sense, because we're going to be using this style throughout the code just to make it cleaner and more readable. Because this it's apparent what's going on here, but at the same time, if we can be obvious with our actions and do it within one line, that's going to be a lot cleaner. So we're going to be using list comprehension as able. Okay, so just to run over that one more time, we're assigning each of the values in our modal value to j, and then we're comparing j against none, and we're saying if j is not none, we're going to include that in this new list that we've made right here. Okay? So now, if they submit a null value into the modal, it's not going to be a null value in our code. Awesome. Okay, so I believe there's only one more button that we need to take care of, and that is rates. So let's go back over here into our details UI, and down at the bottom, let's make a rates modal. And it's going to be a frog modal, like the rest of them. And in the init, let's take our current value, which is an optional string, remember, going back to being an easy handling case here. And let's call the superclass. What do we want to call this? Let's call this title equals profile rates section, because the rates is going to be its own section on the profile. It's going to be its own chunk. All right, so let's make our instructions. Since the behavior is pretty similar between instructions fields, I'm just going to copy and paste this guy from up here. And we will, let's see, what do we want to put for our placeholder? What do we want to tell, what's the easiest basic way to explain a rates section to our user? Well, there's no special behavior in our rates section really, so we can just say, enter your rates section information here. Or below. That was a struggle. Okay. So, but let's elaborate a little bit. Let's be more verbose with the user, and we're going to say enter the information for your rates section exactly as you want it displayed on your profile. Actually, let's not say the word profile twice. Just like that. And then let's add a new line. And just so this particular line stands out a little bit, we'll say this supports Markdown and emojis. Okay, so if the user were to input something like a double underscore on either side of their text in the modal, that will translate to underlined text in our embed. So we want to let them know, yeah, definitely use Markdown, use emojis, customize this, make it your own. It will display properly. Cool. So let's make the other field here, self.addItemInput text. And then the style for this one is actually going to be a multi-line. Because since this is a field, this may potentially be a lot of information, and we want the user to have a feeling for how their information is organized and how it's formatted for when they put it onto their profile. Okay, so let's label it rates section. And what do we want to put for the placeholder? Well, I'm not terribly creative. Some people have lots of rate tiers, lots of rate structures, you know, if it's an hour, if it's a session, if it's a photo shoot, if it's 4 hours of DJing, whatever the case might be. I don't want to plan for all of that, so I'm just going to say, for example, 250K gil, which is the currency in the game that I play, per photo shoot. Okay, that's a pretty simple cost breakdown. And it should give them a starting point. It should give the user a starting point of how to define their own rates. Okay, so let's say the value is equal to the current value like we have been, because if they've already got a rates field, we want that to automatically populate. And we're going to say the max length of this is, let's say 500. Okay, it's highly doubtful that anyone's going to hit that 500 character cap. But we want to give them the freedom to extrapolate on the rates if they want to. 500 should be more than enough. We may come back and make it lower later, but for now that's where we're going to set it. And then we do want to make the rates field nullable because they may stop performing their photo services or whatever job that they do. So we want to make sure that they can null this out and still retain their same profile. Cool. Let's do our callback. So self.value, which is what we're going to assign first, is self.children sub1.value if self.children sub1.value. So if that value exists, we're going to assign it. Otherwise, we're going to assign none. And then we can mark self.complete as true. send back our dummy interaction, and we can call self.stop to close the modal. Okay, hopefully this behavior is kind of ingraining itself in your head. Let's go back up here to the top. Before we forget, let's go ahead and export our rates modal in Dunder all. And then let's make a button to expose the function that we're about to write. So it'll be a rates button, and it can be a profile section button as well. And within our init, we're going to take the rates, which is an optional string, remember. And let's call the superclass. So how do we want this button to look? Well, the label is going to be rates. It's not going to be disabled. And the row is going to be 1. Remember, because we want it in the second row. Let's call self.setStyle on the rates that we passed in. And then let's define our callback. So the callback for this is going to be pretty straightforward, just like the other ones that we've been doing. We can just copy, paste the callback in here, set rates, and then pass in underscore rates to the style function. And just like that, now we have a button that will let us set our rates as well. So before we move to a different module, here in the UI details, let's go down to our details status view, and let's add the 2 buttons that we just made. So we added a jobs button, right? And we need to pass in self.details.underscore jobs. And then we also need to make a rates button, and we're going to pass in underscore rates for that. Okay, we're going to make one more button, but it's going to be in a future video, and it's going to be the close message button that allows us to clean up after ourselves. But for now, I just want to have the 5 major buttons that correspond to the data points here so we can test that out. Okay, so let's go over into our profile details, and let's set up the set rates function so that we don't get an error when we click on the button. So we'll call it set rates, not det rates. And this is going to take in an interaction, and it's not going to return us anything. And then, quite honestly, I'm going to come up here to color or jobs or whichever, and I'm just going to copy the behavior, because ultimately this is the same behavior. We're just changing what modal we put in, what value we pass to the modal, and then ultimately what value we're taking back from the modal and where we're assigning it. So here in set rates, we're instantiating a rates modal. We're sending it and waiting. If it's not complete, don't worry. Otherwise, let's set those rate values based on the value of the modal. Okay, so this should be everything that we need to test all 5 of the data points in our profile details class. Technically, we have 6 since there's a post URL data point, but this isn't going to come into play until a lot later. Once we've posted our profile and once we have the database logic to update our profile after it's been posted, then we'll handle this. But I wanted to make sure that we put it in during the process of creating this class so we could plan for it in some of our other functions. Okay, so enough of me talking. Let's start the bot, and let's jump back over to Discord here. And we'll see if the testing command works. Okay, very good. So stylistically, I'm not super thrilled with these buttons and how they look. So we may change the text on the buttons. We may change the order of the buttons. But for now, our 2 additional buttons have appeared. So let's check our jobs first. Okay, so our instructions are appearing. We can put in our jobs. And it maxes out, as you can see, once we get to 20 characters. That's good. Okay, and let's submit that. Okay, awesome. Our jobs button updated, and so did our jobs field. And it's even formatted in the proper way. So that's awesome. Let's also set our rates field. Okay, and it looks like that's working well too. So we're in business. So our profile details class is now able to accept and hold data, although it's limited to the lifespan of the bot for now. But once we implement database logic, that information is going to retain between bot restarts. Okay, but for the time being, we have the buttons and we have the modals, and we can process that data and get it into the class properly, which is what I want to do right now, or which is what I wanted to do during this video. So I think we're going to stop for now. The next video, I want to come back and I want to refactor a couple of minor things, and I also want to look at error handling. So if you remember over here in our UI details, if we come down here to the color modal, we have a to-do of writing error logic. So I want to take care of that in the next video, and then we'll do a couple of minor tweaks just to make things look a little better and function a little better as well. So, hey, I really appreciate everyone who's been watching and who's been being positive in the comments and leaving likes. That makes me feel really good because this is my first tutorial video, and I wasn't sure how it would go over, but all of you who've been commenting and liking, I really appreciate it. And hopefully you enjoy this in future videos. So thanks a lot.